Dobry день, вітаємо вас в подкасті Чорне небо Stop.
Good morning.
Як завжди,
Welcome to the Black Sky Stop Fake podcast. As always, I apologize for my Ukrainian, but today, Artur Jacques, who knows Ukrainian better than me, will speak more. Artur Jacques from Lviv and from Vilnius will be speaking Voles Yamashko in her native Belarusian, which is fully understandable to Ukrainians. And of course, our podcast will also be in English. Today we will talk about Russia and Belarus's use of military potential for propaganda and disinformation. So it's not that weapons are used in battle or even used for their intended purpose, but that they are used for propaganda and manipulation. I don't know if you agree with me, but I hope so. Artur.
Не знаю, чи ви зі мною згідні, але надіюся, що так, Артуре.
Yes, that is correct. Very often states use military capabilities, the latest developments, to promote their propaganda before using these weapons. This is natural. Only in Russia has this cult of the Wunderwaffe been taken almost to the point of absurdity. For decades, we have been fed this. And above all, the citizens of Russia have been fed it. They were fed this vision of the Wunderwaffe. We remember well the Kinjal, which no air defense systems were supposed to be able to shoot down. Onyx, Solntsepyak, the various nomenclature of these weapons. As became clear on the battlefield, state-of-the-art air defense systems have the ability to shoot down both Onyx and Kinjal frequently. The Russians also use such a slogan, "Counterparts don't exist." They say, for example, that a given missile, a given complex, is hypersonic. Very often later, after checking it on the battlefield, it turns out that this is also disinformation. It is also propaganda. Because in addition to the fact that the Kinjal, for example, flies at hypersonic speeds for certain flight segments, however, to approach the target directly, to hit the target, it has to slow down. And then newer systems, such as Patriot, have the ability to knock it down.
And what does it look like in Belarus, both in the use of weapons and capabilities? Is the arsenal also used for propaganda and disinformation?
Yes, indeed. Right now, the most powerful weapon of Belarusian propaganda is the Oreshnik. Following the Russians, they started claiming that this weapon is unparalleled and that Belarus and Russia, with this weapon, will achieve victory. As soon as the first tests of this Oreshnik appeared and the initial information about the use of this weapon emerged, Belarusian propaganda, followed by the authorities, began to claim that this weapon must also be stationed in Belarus. They immediately began elaborating on how beneficial it would be for Belarus and how the country would now be protected not only by the nuclear umbrella, but also by the weapon that has no analogs. Lukashenko immediately began requesting this weapon from Putin. The first such discussions took place back in Kazakhstan. For several weeks now, the topic of whether the Oreshnik will be stationed in Belarus or not has been repeatedly discussed. And according to the latest information, because in Belarus, all the latest information regarding weapons comes from Lukashenko. He stated that he had reached an agreement with Putin, and as soon as this weapon is put into service with the Russian army, it will also appear in Belarus. Belarus is already prepared, Putin has given his consent, and there are already 30 sites in Belarus under consideration for where this Oreshnik could be stationed. The most important point is that Belarus is not only ready to use this weapon, but will also participate in its production, meaning that the launcher for this weapon will be manufactured at Belarusian enterprises. They even announced that the first munitions for this Oreshnik would arrive in Belarus in 2025. The question that Belarusian propagandists cannot answer is, who will be responsible for using this weapon? Will it be Belarus, or will nothing be possible without directives from Moscow? Now they have started saying that if the weapon is stationed in Belarus, all decisions will be made by Belarus. In general, they suggest that the installation should be placed in Brest because this is considered the most advantageous position. They even calculated the flight time of the Oreshnik to European capitals and demonstrated a map showing how long it would take for the Oreshnik to reach Berlin, London, and other cities. The situation with the Oreshnik is reminiscent of the situation with nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory. This information first emerged in 2023. It was Putin's response to the U.S. policy of deploying weapons in European countries. It is evident that Lukashenko and Belarusian propaganda seized upon this idea because there were repeated statements and many films made on Belarusian television asserting that the withdrawal of nuclear weapons from Belarus in the 1990s was a grave mistake. They claimed that Belarus was left defenseless, without this umbrella, and therefore this weapon must be brought back to Belarus by any means necessary, whether truthful or not. This is precisely what Lukashenko has been trying to achieve. The issue of nuclear weapons in Belarus remains a great mystery because propaganda, the authorities, and Russia claim that such weapons are present on Belarusian territory. However, independent investigators doubt this and even provide examples, pointing out that there is no specialized military unit to guard these weapons, and that the work on the storage site for these munitions has only just begun. This entire discussion about nuclear weapons reminds me of a game of ping pong. State media report that the weapons are present, while independent media refute this information. Now, Lukashenko has again begun insisting that these weapons are present. I believe that the situation with the Oreshnik, its presence on Belarusian territory, will look similar. There will be a lot of fog, and nothing will be clear.
Vola, who do you think is the target of this Lukashenko propaganda? Is it aimed primarily at an internal audience, or is it, however, to scare Belarus's external neighbors? Is it, as you said, aimed at various European capitals? Is Lukashenko trying to intimidate Berlin, Paris, or perhaps Warsaw? Or is this all calculated as part of a war with Ukraine?
Залікувати там Берлін, Париж чи може Варшаву, а може це все розраховане як елемент війни проти України?
I would say that this propaganda has several layers. First of all, it is aimed at residents within Belarus. Why? Because Lukashenko has positioned himself for many years as the defender of Belarus. We know that Belarus is allegedly under threat of attack from all sides, and there is even a map to prove it. Therefore, it is important for Lukashenko to demonstrate that he has reached agreements with Russia and will be able to defend Belarus if such an attack occurs. He supposedly guarantees such security for Belarus. Moreover, Russia has adopted a new nuclear doctrine, according to which, in the event of an attack on Belarus, Russia will be able to use nuclear weapons. This is one aspect to calm the population within Belarus.
Насельніцтва ўнутры Беларусі, таму што трэба разумець, што зараз вось гэта мілітарыская рыторыка, ваенная рыторыка, яна ў Беларусі проста...
It is important to understand that militaristic rhetoric is gaining such momentum in Belarus now that everything being said in the country is about war, and everyone is preparing for it. Demonstrating the role of a defender of Belarus is therefore very important for Lukashenko. This is one aspect. Another aspect is how Belarusian propaganda is integrated into Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda aims to scare the world. The fact that Belarus is included in this global intimidation in such rhetoric that weapons with no analogues will strike not only from Russian territory but also from Belarusian territory is part of Lukashenko's propaganda game. How much this is believed in European capitals is a different question. They study and consider it. I follow how it is perceived in the Baltic countries and how Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia react. They listen to all the narratives coming from Belarus, but there is a tendency where no one views Lukashenko as an independent player on the political stage anymore. It is said that if any decision is made about using weapons, it will certainly be Lukashenko making the decision, but only after receiving a call from Moscow telling him when to press the red button.
Самастойна Лукашэнкам, а яму проста там патэлефануюць з Масквы і там у адпаведны момант скажуць націснуць гэты чырвоны гузік.
Arthur, did you want to add something?
Since we mentioned Oreshnik, Putin also assured that Belarus will get its copies on Belarusian territory in the second half of 2025. In addition, I also wanted to say about propaganda. As Vola said, Russian propaganda is linked to Belarusian propaganda, and there too the Oreshnik is being used in two directions. Internally, that is, for that layer of Russian society that lives in the cult of various kinds of weapons. As I mentioned earlier, we can see over RPZestist decades how this cult has developed. Moreover, for that part of Turbo-Z patriotic society that expresses concern that Russia defines its so-called red lines, and that Ukraine and the West often cross these red lines, and there is no appropriate response, in their view. And the use of Oreshnik on November 21st of this year to strike the Pivdenmash in the Dnipro was supposedly such a response. And the second part of this propaganda is directed primarily at Western countries. It was intended to frighten the Western powers and reduce military aid, and aid to Ukraine in general. Of course, Russians also often associate this with allowing the scientific use of American, French, or British weapons deep inside Russian territory.
Україні. Звісно, росіяни часто пов'язують також це з дозволом на вдаряння в глиб Росії американською і там французькою чи британською зброєю, але варто зазначити одну.
However, one thing is worth noting. Ukraine has already hit Russian territory in the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk regions anyway. All these are territories recognized by Russia as its own, and Ukraine has repeatedly hit these areas. Moreover, Russia and Putin very often use weapons almost as Olga said in Kazakhstan, where he decided to tell his colleagues from other countries about Oreshnik, although experts say no one asked him to do so. He often spreads such disinformation that it is indeed not a nuclear weapon, but a conventional one, but is comparable in strength to a meteorite strike. This, of course, can be refuted even by simple mathematical calculations. For there to be such a force, even at such a speed, as a nuclear or as the force of a meteorite impact, this warhead would have to be at least hundreds of tons, and there are no missiles that can carry such large payloads. In addition, the expert pointed out why the strike took place in Dnipro and not, for example, in Kiev, because we have been told all along that the strike should be on the decision center. Most likely the point is that there is a much lower saturation of defense systems in Dnipro than in Kiev, and if from the Russian point of view, God forbid, some Patriot or Iris system would shoot down such a missile, the whole propaganda goal would not be achieved.
З російського пункту бачення, не дай Боже, би якась система Patriot чи там IRIS-T збила таку ракету, то весь пропагандистичний, ця пропагандистична ціль би була не осягнута. Але
But we can see that, for example, in addition to the fact that Russian propaganda has engaged and these narratives have worked in the domestic market, they have not in the external market. Even the Americans, after that first reaction, when they withdrew their diplomats from their jobs, closed their diplomatic missions before the attack, and not only them, because the Greeks also, if I'm not mistaken. Italy also closed its embassy on that day. After which most experts, as well as Pentagon officials, say it is just a propaganda weapon. Moreover, for example, I was also surprised by Putin's response. He was recently asked whether Russia is developing further nuclear weapons and whether the change in military doctrine is due to the fact that Russia is ready to use nuclear weapons. Putin said, "We don't need to develop nuclear weapons now. We need to develop Oreshnik, because its potential is identical to that of nuclear weapons, which is not true at all." This can also be seen from the effects of the Dnieper attack. It is a rather inaccurate weapon, because this weapon is a modification of the Rubej system.
По наслідкам атаки в Дніпрі, це доволі неточна зброя, бо та зброя – це ж модифікація систему Рубіж.
Experts say that simply one of the segments or part of the engine of the rocket weapon has been removed, and therefore it has a slightly shorter operating range. Rubej has a range of 2,000 to 6,000 kilometers, and here experts say that probably Oreshnik has a range of 2,000 kilometers, but for Ukraine this changes nothing. At the moment, it's nothing, because most of the nomenclature of missile weapons that have been used against Ukraine reach every square meter of Ukraine. This means that this is just propaganda and intimidation of the Ukrainian population as well, because any use of weapons that have not been used before is a trigger for the population. We have seen this for many weeks now, how often the word Oreshnik is used in the information space and even in ordinary conversations between Ukrainian citizens. Although, for example, yesterday, since we are recording this podcast on December 17th, at a meeting with the Department of Defense, Putin reiterated once again that serial production of the Oreshnik has already been established, but at the same time said that the nuclear capability of the Russian Federation, for example, has been modernized by 95%. This is the kind of synergy, playing with weapons information which is intended to influence, as Volha said and as I have already said, society in Russia, Western or world societies in general, as well as Ukrainian society.
В Росії, на західні суспільства або взагалі на світове суспільство, ну, але і також на суспільство України.
Volha, if you'll allow me, because there was a problem connecting with Artur. Such are the realities that this connectivity is often lost here. This is due to the energy situation in Ukraine. When you talked about this attack on Ukrainian territory that Russia simply considers its own, It's very important not to sound wrong. We don't consider any part of Ukraine's territory within its internationally recognized borders as Russian territory. It's just that the connection was a bit lost, and this sentence came out strongly ambiguous.
Of course. Yes, of course. I simply meant that Ukraine strikes on territories that Russia considers its own. It even has it written in the Constitution. But even in Russia, there are different positions on this issue, because we see how sometimes, even in the conversations of official representatives of the Russian Federation, there is a certain gradation between the so-called sovereign territory of Russia and the occupied territories. Nevertheless, from their point of view, it is the territory of the Russian Federation, as enshrined in their constitution. Of course, only in their view. Of course, no one in the normal civilized world agrees with this opinion.
I would like to add something here. Looking at how the world reacts to all these Russian narratives, I am very pleased to see that people have become accustomed to what Russian propaganda says. If we recall the beginning of the attack on Ukraine, everyone believed that the Russian army was the second strongest army in the world, that it would defeat everyone, and that fighting it was pointless. This was a myth that Russia cultivated for several years before launching this offensive. And what did we see? This myth crumbled literally within a week. Another myth of Russian propaganda is about this weapon with no analogs. Even when speaking with very reasonable representatives of Russia at international forums, people who did not support the war, they genuinely believed that Russia possessed such superweapons. They spoke about it with absolute seriousness. I was told in complete seriousness, "You cannot even imagine what kind of weapon Russia has. We are testing it now, and if we use it, you will be very surprised. And why haven't we used it yet? Because not all red lines have been crossed." And what do we see now? Well, if the Oreshnik is this superweapon, then it will be treated accordingly abroad.
Besides, one more thing. I have been paying attention. They often mix up the concept of missile range. Very often they talk about, for example, ATACMS or Strom Shadow as long-range missiles. And these are short-range missiles. And Oreshnik is a medium-range missile. Because if, for example, ATACMS fly at about 300 kilometers and Oreshnik fly at 2,000 kilometers, these cannot be the right terms. And this is very often used in Russian propaganda, and in Ukraine such a false concept appears. And also in the West, these weapons produced in the West are often referred to as long-range missile systems. And here I don't know whether it's simply incompetence on the part of journalists or whether the Russians have managed to impose such an opinion in order to demonize the use of Western weapons against Russian targets.
Artur, I'll put it this way. They are playing on this. There are very few specialists who can explain it in simple terms so that everyone understands. And the Russians are exploiting this lack of experts in the propaganda field, and their propaganda is very loud. By shouting over normal, reasonable voices, they manage to convey their narratives.
That's what I wanted to ask, only briefly because our time is running out. What do you think is the susceptibility of Western society to this Russian and Belarusian propaganda? To what extent do people perceive this exaggeration of military potential as truth?
Тепер трошки менше, але я знаю, я бачив, як це десятиліття
Now a little
виглядало
less,
з перспективи
but I've seen how it looked for
Польщі,
decades, for
навіть,
example, from the
людьми,
perspective of
які
Poland.
скептично ставилися
Even
до
when I
Росії,
talk
як
to
до,
people who were
як
skeptical
до
of Russia
відомого
as a hegemon,
тиранії,
they also used,
до
as
війни
Volha said,
також
such a narrative that Russia has the latest weapons that have no analogues in other
Росія має
countries.
зброю, яка новітня, яка не має аналогів в інших
This could be heard very often in conversations. You could even read it in specialized publications. Therefore, I believe that Russia still has a lot of influence in this field, although factually the experience of the war in Ukraine, this experience has largely dispelled this myth of the Second World Army.
Цей досвід по великій мірі розвіяв цей міф Другої армії світу.
I will say something about Belarusian propaganda. It is more likely aimed at a domestic audience. I do not think that even in nearby capitals, people are paying much attention to what Lukashenko says. This is because an opinion has already formed. Lukashenko says only what Putin allows him to say. And if we talk about how influential Russian propaganda is and how much people believe it, then after 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, trust in all of it has significantly declined. It has practically become impossible to scare anyone anymore. And whereas in the past we saw cautious statements from NATO or the United States regarding Russian weapons,
там такі доволі осторожні заяви, у тим ліку і НАТО, у тим ліку і з боку США на конт російської воєнної зброї, то коли порівняти...
If we compare them with the current rhetoric, everyone now understands Russia's military potential, assesses it appropriately, and can make statements that 3 years ago would have been impossible.
Які 3 роки тому ще були немагчими.
I remember such pictures. The aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov, which was supposed to be a demonstration of Russian strength. Those Russian victory parades in Moscow, and that Armata tank, which was supposed to be invincible. And now we have this Oreshnik. And these are all things that, in the end, however, were not at all as terrifying as they were supposed to be. More propaganda than real possibilities. Can we end there, or is there anything else Arthur would like to add?
Na tomu możemy вже закінчити, чи Артур щось хочеш ще добавити?
No, I think we've said almost everything.
Almost. In the time we have, almost everything has been said. This was the Black Sky, Stop Fake Podcast. Arthur Jacques, Vola Simashko, Pavel Bobolovich, thank you very much and welcome to our next materials.